Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 4th of October. Today we're going to be doing a frontline update starting off with the Verbove sector and we'll end with Spirne. I do apologize for not uploading recently. I was on vacation, but now I'm back, so this video is going to be pretty long. We're going to go into some detail about the most important parts of the front line, starting off with what's going on around Novoprokopivka. And to be honest, in terms of pure territory, not much has changed after really weeks of fighting on the northern outskirts of this village. As you can see, I have shifted the gray zone and expanded it a little bit. So now this area over here, the northernmost part of the village, is also considered a gray zone because of the Ukrainian activities in this region. They don't have solid control over it. They have not really entered it with a firm position, but the Russians don't have full control over this area either. So it is really a gray zone. The Ukrainians do have solid positions, although they are being hit very, very heavily by the Russian forces in the trench system to the south of Verbove, but we're going to get to that in a second. In the village of Novoprokopivka itself, most of the action is actually coming from the air. And what I mean by this is that you have a lot of activity that's being coordinated between the 3rd National Guard Brigade, which is this unit that I have over here. It's a unit that's been on the Urozhaine sector for a really long time, but we've not really seen much of it. And they're working in conjunction with the 44th Artillery Brigade, and they're conducting FPV strikes, and they're conducting just artillery strikes in general on the Russian positions within Novoprokopivka, what remains of them. What you'll see is that much of the village of Novoprokopivka is still not totally devastated from the war. A lot of the areas, even if they do have a certain extent of damage to them, a lot of the structures over here, they could still be used for cover. There's still basements in a lot of these houses, so that's a very good place to station Russian platoons that are still operating in this region and have still not been targeted by the Ukrainian forces. And there's still some different equipment over here, vehicles that are stationed in this area, and there's still a lot of trenches and dugouts in this entire village that still have to be taken over, and the Russians are still utilizing. Here we actually have footage from the Garuda drone unit, which is a part of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade. I'll show the footage that they posted. Most likely this footage is a bit older because this is something that a lot of Ukrainian drone units do. They released it a couple of weeks after they're initially recorded. You can see in the video that the FPVs are hitting the northern barns that I have marked as a gray zone on my map. They also hit forward trenches, dugouts, and if you move a bit forward in the video, I'll move to the part that I'm talking about. There's also some strikes on the actual village center, where you could see that some of the structures over here have suffered some damage, others not as much, and that there are still Russian personnel and some Russian equipment, not heavy equipment, but still some Russian like vehicles. As I said before, there was a quad bike that I saw over there that are being targeted by the Ukrainian forces. You also have Ukrainian formations that are attempting to take out Russian mortar positions. This mortar is actually in the southern part of Novoprokopivka, so it is very close to the front line. And you can see how the 44th Artillery Brigade is attempting to take it out. And this is just a microcosm of what's going on the front line. The Russians have mortars stationed in some of these tree lines that still have a lot of foliage in order to give them some sort of concealment, but they're still trying to fire onto the Ukrainian small groups that are advancing in the direction of this village using those mortars. Now, to back up what I was saying about the Ukrainians having a presence in the trench systems that are to the south of Verbove, here we have a video of artillery from the 42nd Motor Rifle Division. And I'll click on that video right now. You could see that the artillery, it hits Ukrainian positions in that trench, and the specific area is along a road that is to the south and goes in the direction of Novoprokopivka. Like, for instance, you could see the view over here of that village, and you can see the road itself, which the Ukrainians, they would have hoped at least to utilize vehicles on. And you could see in the actual video itself that there are 3 vehicles that the Russians presumably destroyed of Ukrainians. So those are Ukrainian vehicles that were attempting to advance towards Novoprokopivka. But the issue over here is that it's so close to the line of contact, and the Russians do still have a presence of artillery that is firing onto this region, and it's a completely open area besides those trenches where you could try to see concealment. So concentrating a large amount of forces and concentrating vehicles so close to the line of contact it does lead to issues, not even just from artillery, but also from ATGM crews that Russia has in the region, because it is like a distance of a couple hundred meters. So you could have those firing onto Ukrainian vehicles. And this is the result. It's the fact that the Ukrainians could only really send in small groups, and they try to do it, especially at night, to try to infiltrate into Novoprokopivka, but no major storming operations. So here is the area that we were just seeing in that video. This is the geolocated marker, and this is the road that I was talking about. The Russians, they actually tried to counterattack multiple different times over the past couple of weeks towards this trench system, and I've already explained why. It's because it's located on a height. It's a fortified area that could be used as a gathering point for Ukrainian forces. We've shown how it's difficult for the Ukrainians to do that, though, just because of how close it is to the front line. But either way, the Russians, they did try launching attacks through this forested area towards the trench system. A couple of weeks ago, that failed. Now we have additional footage from Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade showing that at least 3 tanks were hit by Ukrainian forces as they were advancing along this road and tried to flank the trench system from the west and try to enter from there, which does show that, again, the Ukrainians have control over it, and the Russians were unable to retake it in their counterattacks. So here's that video, and as you can see, as I'll skip forward a little bit, you can see the tank advancing in the direction of the trench system. What's important to note is that even though the FPV does hit the tank, it does seem like it's moving afterwards, so it wasn't destroyed. It seems like it is still operational from what I'm seeing. What I would take away from this, though, is that it doesn't appear that there are any mines in this area. And I'll go back to the map for a second. But this road that I'm marking in red is very, very close to the front line, even before the beginning of the counteroffensive. So it is behind some of Russia's original minefields. But I would have expected for there to be mines in the area unless they were cleared out by either side's forces in order to allow for the movement of vehicles through that area. Either way, unless I'm missing something that could be proven by other pieces of footage in this area, it seems like there aren't much or any mines that are going along this road, which could be a benefit to Russia, for instance, if they want to continue attacks in this direction. But it could also be a benefit to Ukrainians who have been looking to take over Kopani. They have been unable to advance on Verbov's western flank for a very long time, as they've been trying to storm the trenches to the west of it. And that's been a very arduous process, which has yielded little to no results. But if we look further south, the Ukrainians could, and we've already seen them move vehicles into this area. So they do have a route open to them that appears to not have any mines that goes in the direction of Kopani. If you zoom out, that road does eventually lead into the village of Kopani, which is still a major Russian defensive node in this region on the flanks of Ukraine salient. Now, looking at the fields to the east of Verbove, which is a section that, again, it's been pretty ignored compared to the fighting in Verbove and Novoprokopivka, respectively. A big part of why is because we're not really seeing much of any movement by the Ukrainians over here. For a couple of weeks now, they've had these fort positions stationed over here in some of the dugouts and some of the tree lines. They're a couple hundred meters north of Russia's first Surovikin line, which is over here. They've been unable to advance any further, and this is because really to advance further, you have to go through open fields. A lot of these tree lines no longer have the same amount of foliage, so there's really little cover, little concealment. So the Russian infantry that's stationed at the first trench line, they do spot them and do fire upon them. So it is very difficult to assault it head on. And as a result, really the front line is not shifted. And all over here, you do actually have the Russian units, such as their VDV elements in this region. And in this specific instance, they were shelling the Ukrainian forces with a BMD-4. And I'll link that video in the description for you guys. It's on my map, I mean. And then if we go a bit to the east to Verbove, in this area, again, not much has changed since my last update. It's still positional, the fighting over here. The Ukrainians are still trying to move in additional men across the anti-tank ditch and the Dragon's Teeth in this area. And they are trying to increase their utilization of IFVs and just of any sort of vehicle in general, also civilian cars. They're trying to move in forces through in order to increase the amount of men within their pool that can be used to launch further attacks with small scale assaults, a couple of men to advance deeper and deeper across the flanks and directly into Verbove itself. But we are not really seeing any territorial changes at the moment, at least. A big part of why is because any sort of substantial gains are hindered by the fact that Russian artillery and drone fire is very, very present on the roads that lead towards the line of contact in the direction of Verbove. Like you have this one road over here, which is a road that Ukraine has used extensively, where they moved a lot of their Bradleys and Strikers through to reach towards Verbove. The issue is it's just a completely open area. They're not receiving any cover, and you have Russian drones that are targeting Ukrainian forces over there. So the Ukrainians are forced to use small groups and to use vehicles to a lesser extent. That's been a major theme for the past month or even more, and it's a big part of why Ukraine has not been able to organize a large force, a large troop concentration with vehicles that would assist in really helping the Ukrainians to dismount, because whenever they do try to do that, there are these looming threats of, for instance, the Beaver unit or the Sudoplatov battalion that it hits the Ukrainian forces really before they reach the line of contact, a couple hundred meters or maybe like a kilometer or two before the front line, in roads such as the one mentioned over here. And there's some footage of that I've linked on my map that I'm not going to show just because of the graphic nature of it, not just to the vehicles, but also to soldiers that are trying to enter the trench systems near Verbove itself. But yeah, that's the same situation around Verbove. While Ukraine focuses most of its efforts on the Verbove sector, the Russians were actually able to retake some very small positions that they lost in August. And these are just to the northeast of the village of Pryyutne, which is a village that Ukraine, really, they did try to attack it from multiple different directions. You had the attack from the northwest, you had that attack from the north directly, and a lot of that was facilitated by the fact that Ukraine had control over a local gully called the Klishchiivka gully, which is a gully over here. I'm marking it in blue. It was sort of like this Ukrainian fort position, still is in certain instances in Zaporozhye Oblast and Donetsk Oblast, because there's there's actually two parallel tree lines that run through and adjacent to the gully, and so that's where you had some Ukrainian forces setting up dugouts and coordinating assaults before going further south towards the Russian positions. But now what you see is that the Russians, first of all, have expanded control of fields to the north of Pryyutne, which prevents a Ukrainian assault directly from the north, and they also took over parts of the gully itself. And what this means is that they first of all are able to protect Pryyutne's flanks from the northeast. They also regained certain high ground positions in the fields to the south of the gully, because you got to remember that a lot of the fields that are to the west of the Novomykhailivka River in this region, here's the Novomykhailivka River, a lot of these fields that Russia is holding on to, and some of them Ukraine is actually now holding on to the north of the line of contact. A lot of them are on higher elevation compared to the Novomaiorske River Valley and all of the villages adjacent to it, like Urozhaine, like Novomaiorske, which is a big part of why the Ukrainians want to push the Russians out of this area in order to prevent the Russians from firing upon advancing Ukrainians or just defensive Ukrainian positions in some instances on the Velika-Novosilka axis. And this also does, as I said before, take out a forward Ukrainian position that they were using. Now, around Urozhaine over the past week, we've seen the Russians increase the intensity of their counterattacks. And a lot of these counterattacks are coming directly from the east. Some of them are also coming from this road that is directly to the south of Urozhaine. The Russians were able to advance a couple hundred kilometers and take over some of the open fields that are to the east of Urozhaine, but there's been no real entrance into the village itself. What I will say, though, is that starting in late September, information started coming out about the presence of the 58th Motorized Brigade, which is a Ukrainian unit that we've not heard from in a very long time near Urozhaine. This unit, if you remember from my previous reporting on the war going months back, it was previously located on the rear around Sumy, and before that it fought heavily in the Battle of Bakhmut, where it was really on the front line for a huge chunk of that battle. And after that, it was moved to the Kreminna front, which is a lower intensity part of the front line. But again, they were still conducting combat operations over there, and they were fighting on the Kreminna front if you zoom out, like around here. And they were doing that during the summer before eventually being rotated out, being sent to the rear in Sumy Oblast. Now we're seeing them at the front line again as they were trying to repel some Russian assaults. And this unit is now working in conjunction with several other units in the region that we've not heard much from, but it seems like this is the new Ukrainian vanguard in this region, the new Ukrainian forward defensive units that have been rotated in to sort of give the Ukrainian Marine brigades in this region that have been fighting for so long and conducting offensive activities a bit of a rest, because we not heard much from these Marine brigades like 35th, 36th, 37th, 38th, those four Marine brigades. We've not heard much from them in the past few months. It seems like their positions have at least been replenished or replaced by units like the 58th Motorized Brigade, like the Birds of Magyar. This is an air reconnaissance group drone unit. Also by the Separate Presidential Brigade. I'm not sure if it's stationed over here on my map. I think it's around Avdiivka, but there's also proof of their presence on this front. And also artillery support from the 55th Artillery Brigade. Now, this incident is from a couple of days ago, but what it shows, and I wasn't able to talk about it, is that the Russians, this is when they really started launching that counterattack that I just mentioned along that road to the south of Urozhaine, utilizing tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. But the aforementioned Ukrainian units that I listed out, like the 58th, they utilize FPVs, they use javelins, mortars. They actually also use their cluster munitions, which we've seen them use on the Velika-Novosylka axis for a couple of months now. And that sort of combined arms was able to lead to the destruction of six Russian tanks and 3 BMPs. This photo and this other one, they show a part of that. And this is just from a couple of days ago. Since then, there's been some additional footage posted of the extent of that damage. Now, the reason why Russia is tacking this direction is twofold, and I'll show the map to back this up. First of all, the Russians want to prevent the Ukrainians from utilizing the fields to the east of Urozhaine to flank the village of Novodonetske from the western side. And you could see that the Russian fear would be that the Ukrainians would go through these fields and then flank Novodonetske, cut off the road between Novodonetske and Kremenchuk, and then that would have forced the Russians to, either get encircled or withdraw from the village. That's the Russian fear and why they're putting pressure on the eastern outskirts of Urozhaine. And then the other fear is that they don't want the Ukrainians to conduct their own attacks further south of Urozhaine along the same road to the south of the village in the direction of the fortifications that connect Kremenchuk and Stormlinivka. This is a local, defensive fortification that the Russians have set up in this region to prevent further Ukrainian attacks. And they also don't want to see the village of Stormlinivka come under Ukrainian assault, as it is one of Russia's major defensive nodes in the region. And so far, it seems like the Ukrainians have shifted focus away from the Velika-Novosylka axis, and that actually, based off of the rotations of units, they may actually be on more of a defensive footing over here. But if we go a bit to the east to Novomaiorske in this region, they are still conducting attacks. We have this one video that I've linked over here of Ukrainian forces that entered a trench in the northwestern outskirts of Novomaiorske, and they got into a firefight with elements of Russia's 40th Naval Infantry Brigade. So the fighting occurred right over here. So it's not within the village itself, but it shows that the Ukrainians do still have the ability to send in small squads. We're not seeing many vehicles being sent across these fields, across the Shaitanka River towards Novomaiorske, like we saw a couple of weeks ago, but we are still seeing infantry on foot attacking this direction. But so far, the Russians do still hold on to both villages, Novomaiorske and Novodonetske. Now, looking back at Novomykhailivka, I talked about this in my last video, but since then there's been additional reports confirming that the Ukrainians have conducted some minor advances to the east of the village. And as I said before in my last video, they do have control over this fortification, this fortified area, which was taken over by the Russians during the summer. This is based off of a video that was released showing a Russian tank firing onto the Ukrainian positions within this fortified position, which is called Spirne. It's a local stronghold. I believe that it also has machine gun nests and does give whoever controls it this very good view of the surrounding fields, and it gives you a fortified position to actually fire upon any sort of troops or vehicles that are operating in the adjacent areas surrounding it. And so that's why this area is significant. The Russians took it over initially, but it seems like based off of this video, the Ukrainians have control over it. But again, it does seem like a lot of these operations are more so positional in nature, meant to relieve pressure off of Novomykhailivka's northern flank and actually try to increase pressure on Russian-controlled Marinka and that southern flank in this direction. And speaking of positional warfare, that's what we've been seeing around the village of Nevelske for really the entirety of the war. We do have some updates from this region. The Ukrainians have been able to advance a couple hundred meters in the area just to the east of the village, which will relieve some of the pressure off of the village's flanks. As I said in my last video, the intensity of the fighting on Bakhmut's southern flank has decreased in relative terms around Andriivka and also around Klishchiivka. And surprisingly, we have not seen really an intensification of the fights around Pryyutne yet. So we're going to have to wait and see if that ever happens. And then looking a bit to the north at Klishchiivka, the Ukrainians are trying to take over positions within the rail line just to the north of the village. And the Russians, they do still have positions in certain parts of the rail line. Other parts, the Ukrainians are taking over the tunnels and the bunkers that are adjacent to it, including the windbreaks adjacent to the rail line and also some of the fields that are to the south of the rail line. And lastly, looking at the situation in Spirne, there is a minor adjustment that I have to make to the map to indicate that Russia has full control over this eastern portion of the village. This is based off of a video from yesterday showing the 3rd Battalion Svoboda of the Rubizh National Guard Brigade. If you're not aware of this unit, it's just a renaming of the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade. Remember, they were a big part of Ukraine's defense of Bakhmut's northern flank during that entire battle. Now this unit is operating around Spirne, and this battalion, it just shelled this Russian position, located over here if you zoom in on the marker. There is a trench that the Russians constructed in the area, and there's also a house, so those appear to be the forward positions. And again, as I said before about many other parts of the front line, neither side is looking to engage in major offensive activities in this region. It is more so about positional fighting. And that's all for today. So thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.